When I was both young in years and young in the Christian faith, my youth pastor at my church was often appealing to us members of his youth group to share our faith with others. He wanted us to evangelize people by telling them about the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I didn't have a problem with that, and I still don't have a problem with that. I think people need to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ and understand it so they can decide for themselves if they want to be followers of Christ. Although the Bible teaches that there are people in the church with the spiritual gift of evangelism who are especially effective at it, I do believe that all believers should be able to do this, either by telling their own story about how they themselves came to faith in Jesus Christ and became followers of Christ, or by being able to simply and understandably share the gospel and what it means to people. I've had the privilege of doing both of these. I have sometimes shared the story of how I came to Christ, or I've shared the gospel with people in an understandable way. And sometimes people have listened politely and decided that that's not for themselves. And sometimes the light comes on and they understand what Jesus is all about and what church is all about. And they decide that they are going to become followers of Christ. And that's a very satisfying thing to happen. But today I want to talk about one of the best ways that we can share our faith in Jesus Christ with others. And the great thing about this, what I'm going to say, is that it doesn't take a lot of skill to do this. You don't have to spend a lot of time in some kind of training seminar to learn this. It's not very complicated. You don't have to know the answers to those hard questions that a lot of Christians are afraid of being asked. This is a very simple and I believe effective way of sharing our faith. And it's really simple. It is to love one another. See, I've always been intrigued by what Jesus says in John 13:34. He says this during the Last Supper, that time when he's meeting with the disciples in the upper room before he gets arrested and then crucified. He shares quite a bit of with his disciples at that time. And one of the things he says to them is this: "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." Now, I have read and learned from many books and seminars about how to share the gospel with people. But I think that this particular teaching of Jesus needs to be front and center when it comes to reaching people with the gospel. Because Jesus said it's when we love one another that people will know that we are his disciples. And if there's one thing this world is starving for, it's love. When we love one another, we show the world that love and Jesus lives in the church, and they just might want to be a part of that. Now, I've shared my story about how the love I saw at a church was the most compelling reason why I placed my faith in Jesus Christ as a teen. See, at the youth group in the church, I found a group of people who loved one another. They accepted one another. They looked out for one another. They prayed for one another. They invited one another into each other's lives. And I'd never seen anything like it before. The neat thing was that they extended that love to me. Now, I want to tell you just briefly what I didn't worry about or think about when this particular group shared the gospel with me. I didn't care about how beautiful or up-to-date their church building was. I mean, it's nice to have an up-to-date and functional and beautiful church property, don't get me wrong. But that wasn't the deciding factor. I also, surprisingly, didn't care about their doctrines and beliefs, as important as those are. I only knew or assumed some basics about doctrines and beliefs at the time. I mean, I believed in God, yeah. I believed that we learn about the truth of God in the Bible. I believed that Jesus Christ existed and that he died on a cross. I even believed that he rose again. But I just knew the basics. But I didn't come to Jesus because the church had great doctrines and were able to teach me those doctrines. Again, as good as they were teaching those doctrines and as important as those doctrines are, I came to Christ because they loved me. I also didn't care about how wonderful the church programs were, and they were great programs, by the way, to help disciple people. They were effective discipleship tools that they had. I wasn't worried about the programs. And I wasn't even worried about the answers to the hard questions at the time. I cared that they loved me. See, I wasn't perfect. I wasn't a follower of Christ at the time, and I didn't act like a follower of Christ at the time. But they were patient with me, and they accepted me, and they loved me. And then one day, I decided I wanted what they had, and that was Jesus Christ in my life. Friends, never underestimate the role that love plays in the outreach of a church, even if you just love one individual. I recently read a wonderful story of a woman who had a very tough childhood. She was sexually abused from the time she was 3 years old, first by a stranger, then by her neighborhood boys, and then when she was a little older by her own grandfather. It was a terrible story. And when she was still a teen, she entered the sex industry as an exotic dancer and eventually began to work in a body rub parlor somewhere in Toronto. But she met a Christian lady, and this Christian lady took an interest in her and began to just show love to her. And when her boyfriend kicked her out, this Christian lady took her in. Now, she was still working in the sex industry at the time, but this lady took her in, gave her a place to stay, and just kept loving her. And eventually this young woman accepted the gospel of Jesus Christ, became a believer, started going to church, and she experienced even more love within the church. And when she got to the point where she wanted to start a ministry to reach out to sex trafficking victims, the church threw its support behind her, and she now has a ministry not only advocating for sex trafficking victims, but also lobbying the government to stop sex trafficking in Canada. And all this happened because one individual loved her in the name of Jesus Christ. Friends, people will know that we are disciples of Jesus if we love one another. And if we extend that love to them, well, that will go a long way when it comes to sharing the gospel with them. And the neat thing about this is anyone can do it, and we can even do it when we can't meet together as a church. We can still love one another. There's ways that we can love one another. And we can still love our neighbors. Don't need to gather as a church to do that either. We can still share our faith simply by loving our neighbors. So a question I have is, how could you do that during this time? That's something to think about and pray about, and I hope you do. Well, thank you for joining me for my Friday Grace Notes again. I hope that you're able to join us on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock for our live stream again. Again, so far the government has said only groups of 5 are allowed to meet. So we're going to just continue the live stream for now. But thank you for joining me today, and you have a great weekend. Bye now.